Oh, good. Good to see you.
I
Drew.
took my tie off in honor of you guys. Just want to let you know.
Good. It's Sunday. No ties allowed.
That's true.
And good morning, everybody. Officially, welcome to our live webinar in partnership with Serbian Radio Chicago. Serbian-American Voters Alliance is bringing you their expert advisory board. The president of the advisory board, Mr. David Vuich, Dr. Mima Nedelcovych, Mr. Drew Hyatt, and Honorable Judge Ted Poe. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to all of our attendees. Thank you for your incredible interest in what we are doing. Serbian-American Voters Alliance has been formed very recently with the mission to elect candidates to political offices that will uphold, of course, a lot of the values that all of us believe in, and that will fight for the interest of the Serbian-American community. As president of our advisory board, Mr. David Vuich has, of course, spent some valuable time on Capitol Hill over 30 years. And he is, of course, most notable for being a part of that Apollo 7 Serbian mission that sent the man to the moon. So one of our own, and we are incredibly proud of his accomplishments. Honorable Ted Poe, former congressman from our great state of Texas. And I would say Texans are a lot like Serbs. We share a lot in common. And Honorable Judge Poe, aside from being such a champion of freedom and liberty and reasonable voice in Congress, he was also co-chair of the Serbian Congressional Caucus. Mr. Drew Hyatt, who is a political strategist. He is also a lobbyist. He was elected to a political office himself. He has worked on all different levels of the United States government. Drew has been somebody whom I've worked closely with, and he has visited Serbia on several occasions. So we have worked on different projects together, and he was that direct liaison to the White House connections that we have. And of course, Dr. Mima Nedelcovych, somebody whose accomplishments we are also so proud of, and he will tell us about everything that he has done with the African continent, which is so incredible coming from that Serbian background. But you do some great work, of course, in Washington, D.C., in the public and the private sector. And it is exactly the kind of representations that the Serbs would need and that the wider Balkans could benefit from. So we are going to delve straight into this and start with the questions. Each of our responders will have about 2 minutes to respond to each question. And of course, we will keep it up in a conversational type of format. Obviously, my name is Professor Dr. Olga Ravasi. I'm the chairman and founder of Serbian-American Voters Alliance, and I'm incredibly proud of this effort and of this wonderful panel of experts that we have here today. So many questions come from the Serbian-American community directly relating to what Sava Pac is, and in fact, what a PAC does. What is a PAC, and how are we going to use this platform to influence legislation or public policy and to address some of those questions that are of immense importance to the Serbian-American community. So Serbian-American community and Serbs in general have for long lacked proper representation and influence in Washington, D.C. How is Serbian-American Voters Alliance, established as a PAC or a political action committee, looking to change that and engage and educate the Serbian-American community in the political process? I would start with the president of our advisory board.
Well, first of all, the Serbian-American Political Action Committee takes pursuing the political process to a next level. There are 501(c)(3)s and Z4s. The fact remains is there are certain limitations within those organizations. There are certain Serbian organizations that are 501(c)(3)s in which we welcome them, if you will, to recognize the importance what the Political Action Committee represents. Our objective is to see that those seeking elected office, be it in the United States Congress, be it in the Senate or local or state representatives, at least recognize the value of their Serbian constituents, number one. Number two, to at least provide them with the support necessary to see them elected and reelected, and to oppose those who are opposed to our Serbian issues and concerns. So more importantly, looking at it in perspective, we're looking to find those electable members or candidates who recognize and sympathize with the Serbian issues and concerns and will support us in the future. We need to have that political base on Capitol Hill within, if you will, the elements of our U.S. Congress, our local and our state representatives.
Excellent. Can we go to Judge Ted Poe? I am sure you have a lot to contribute to this subject.
Well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. A political action committee is allowed by federal law to engage in political action. And primarily a political action committee raises money and then spends that money in support of candidates, primarily for Congress, but also for the Senate. And the PAC is nationwide, and it's regulated by the election code, and it serves that purpose. I envision that this political action committee will support, find and support and encourage people with a background and a knowledge and a passion for Serbian-American issues and get those folks elected to office. Holding office, and I've held office before I retired for over 30 years as a judge and as a member of Congress. And to get elected, people who run for office have to have financial support. That is the way our system works. So this political action committee will support those candidates that advocate and believe in the passion of making sure the voices of Serbian Americans and those that support Serbian American issues is heard on Capitol Hill. And I'm looking forward to the PAC engaging in that process.
Excellent. Thank you, Judge Poe. And Mr. Hyatt, you as a political strategist can give us an insight into how we take these steps in a concrete way.
Well, I think one of the important objectives of the PAC, and I agree with Congressman Poe and with David, is in this case is to become a focal point for the Serbian American community that helps educate them about the process of being engaged, being involved in the political process, but also to understand that it is not enough today in our current politics just to show up on election day and vote and consider your duty done and that your candidate will win and everything will be fine. With more and more participation from groups that have historically not been as engaged as we've seen from the last election, and also are raising money for candidates, are also knocking on doors, getting out the vote, working at night, holding coffees in their homes, those kinds of activities. Those are the kind of activities that we need to see. But as Congressman Poe said, if there's really no money involved, then you cannot get out your message, you cannot get out your people to vote for you. No one's going to know about you. So money in politics, whether we like it or not, it is a reality. We must, if we want to have the kind of voice we want to have and the kind of influence we want to have in making policies, we must contribute to our candidates that we support, that share our vision and our views and our values.
And Dr. Mima, you have done some incredible work elsewhere, but of course, coming from a Serbian background. So how do you envision this PAC, in fact, addressing some of these crucial issues?
Thank you, Prof. And good morning, good afternoon to all. I guess I'm the oddball in this case here. More the private sector developer has been applying projects all over Africa, although I was born in Belgrade, but left back, I was 2 years old when family moved to Ethiopia. This was the old Yugoslavia and the relationships with Tito and Emperor Haile Selassie at the time. But the interesting part was that I did, in the midst of all my sort of private sector activity, I was a appointee of President Bush, Bush 41, to the African Development Bank as the U.S. executive director. So I've had the taste of the public side of the equation, if you will. And I've really since appreciated that public-private collaboration, if you will, in driving policy, in driving projects, in my case. I've dabbled now and then in Serbian projects, but the importance I do see, and I guess I bring that perspective, is the value of aligning interests between sort of the private interests with the public and the policy interests. And in the end, if you don't play in the public and the policy space, whether that's through a 501c3 or through a PAC, through whatever sort of angle you want to come in on, in the end, it's very simple. Everybody depends on the political sort of positioning and policy, and this is really where it's critical. Coming to the Serbian side, I apply the same sort of perspective, if you will. I mean, if you want to have an impact, if you want to have influence, you got to play the game. To play the game, you got to have the financial support, full stop. It's the same in Africa as it is in Serbia, as it is in the US. So I think this is why I was quite keen in joining this effort you put together, Prof, and I look forward to supporting as best as I can. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And I want to connect our first question to a question that we've heard often since we started a PAC, and this question came directly right before we started from Mr. Yavitrich, and it is directed towards Congressman Poe, but I think all of us can pitch in here because it relates directly to that financial aspect of what a PAC is and why should the Serbian community contribute to the PAC. And it states the Serbian Congressional Caucus has had many influential activists in the past, including but not limited to Melissa Bean, the late George Vojinovic, Rick Santorum, Tom Tancredo, Trent Frank, Sam Brownback, and Dan Burton. After researching campaign finance reports for each of the above, these former elected officials, Serbian Americans, were not prominent donors in their campaign, meaning, and including our congressman, former Congressman Ted Poe, you have done this out of conviction. Everything you've done for the Serbian Americans was out of conviction, and we are eternally grateful for that. But so the point is, in allocating resources, how will Sava differentiate between elected officials who are already ideologically inclined to support Serbian issues versus educating existing officials and candidates on issues on importance to the Serbian American voters? Judge Poe, if we may start with you.
Long question.
Yes, and I have a lot of them and they're very long.
Of course, individuals can contribute to members of Congress and candidates. And then on the other extreme, a PAC is not a lobby. Lobbies are governed by other legislation. So what is a PAC? A PAC is an organization that raises money to support candidates that we have talked about in the past. How is it different? Well, it finds more and more people who are available and as candidates. And right now, I think candidates is a good thing that we should concentrate on, but also individuals who already hold office to support them. So it's all about the support that candidates with Serbian ideals, Serbian American ideals, get elected and stay elected. And the way you do that is, one way is to get all folks who are philosophically supportive of those individuals and have those individuals support a PAC like this PAC. And the PAC then interviews the candidates, elected officials, follows up with their voting records and all of those things as well, and then determines what candidates that the PAC believes support the best interest of Serbian like-minded folks in the United States. So it's different than a caucus. It's different, certainly different than a lobby. And it takes a bunch of individuals and has those individuals contribute to the PAC. And then the PAC supports people and get engaged in the political process. And this is just my opinion. I think that in our country, we have folks that are engaged in the process and those that aren't. One way, as Drew mentioned, is going to vote, holding rallies, sending out postcards, all of that. But money makes the difference in who gets elected. That is the reason government has designed PACs, political action committees, to funnel that money, contribute that money, I should say, to supporting individuals. And here in this case, we want to support people who have those ideals that are philosophically aligned with Serbian-American.
Great, and I would extend this same question to the rest of our panel, but I just want to add, we have received a question from Mrs. Griffin and then Mr. Milo Stevanovic, and they in fact address a very similar thing. Mr. Stevanovic ran for the US House seat, District 36 in California. So his question is, what magnitude of investment is required to make a difference? And then Mrs. Griffin asks to talk a little bit more about the strategy in how we are going to choose these candidates that we are going to support, and how then we will, how do we decide who we are going to in fact financially support? Mr. Hyatt, if you could take the combination of those questions.
I think, can you just summarize again the first one? That was a little bit long, just quickly, just.
Yes, so in fact, many candidates and many previous congressmen have supported Serbian-American issues essentially out of conviction.
Right.
And the Serbian-American community was not a huge donor to their campaigns. So I believe that we are going towards the question of why should we invest in something like this, where we could find candidates who believe deeply, as Judge Poe did, in the plight of the Serbian-American people.
Well, the obvious reason is if you don't want to advocate for your own views and your own vision and your own values of America, and the Serbian-American community, then don't give money. Because those people that do not share your views and your vision and your values, they're giving to the candidates that oppose you. So there is an element of self-interest here, and so we should all be really clear about that. The other thing that I think that is important in this debate is to understand that one of the values or one of the benefits of the Sava Pac is that for the individual, perhaps on a fixed income in Chicago, might be a widow or a widower who can only afford to give $15. $15 by itself will be helpful in perhaps buying, like a congressman said, some postcards and things like that. But if you now pool that $15 with $50 and $100 and $150 and $200, and the PAC can make a contribution to a candidate that it is vetted, that is supporting and supports the Serbian-American community's values and views, then those dollars can be stretched and go a lot further than just the 15. We need the $15, we need the $10, we need the $5, we need any amount of money. The other question I think is there's never really enough money in politics. Just when you think that there's enough, we've looked at some races where, Jeb Bush, for example, raised $130 million to when he ran for the presidency as a candidate. I think the important thing to remember here is that individuals can give, but the PAC allows those dollars to be leveraged to such an extent that they become more valuable than just a single contribution. And together, those voices that stand behind those contributions are then magnified as well by those individuals. Did I answer the last question? I think there was another question.
I believe so. And Mr. Stevanovic was asking what magnitude of investment is required to make a difference. And I believe Mr. David Vuich. Sure.
As much as can be raised.
Yes, and David and Dr. Mima, especially coming from the Serbian background, and our ability to raise money as a community, I'd like to hear about your experiences, especially in that area.
Hi, David.
Well, interesting enough, it's very difficult to pursue an objective like this unless you succeed in gaining access to the political process, number one, but more importantly, to invite and see to it that the Serbian-American community becomes actively involved in the process from a grassroots level all the way up through, if you will, paying more attention to the political process as it pertains to their issues and concerns. Question with respect to the amounts. We have an opposition. The opposition is spending an awful lot of money on the House and the Senate side. They've raised millions of dollars in supporting candidates, of which a good percentage of those dollars have been raised to demonize it, if you will, the Serbian community. And I can bring up a few interesting points here. I said recent events that have occurred in our Serbian community represents a cacophony of accusatory slander that is typical of our identifiable and well-organized opposition. From the decades of controversial issues and concerns of Kosovo to the current tirades of the proposed congressional resolution HR 1045 that condemns Serbia as responsible for the Srebrenica genocide and the pending deportation of Serbian Orthodox priests and the forced resignation of a distinguished professor at a major university that continue to plague our communities represents an urgent cause for concern and corrective action to aggressively address these issues that have had a negative impact on Serbia and its respective diaspora. With the PAC, with the Political Action Committee, we at least will find members of Congress that we recognize are sympathetic to the issues that I made reference to here, that will address those in political perspective, both on the House and the Senate side. We have nobody, with the exception of those who have committed themselves to the Serbian-American Congressional Caucus, but they are only as strong as the input. It's called garbage in, garbage out. And we have yet to establish a strong, what we might want to consider within our element, a very strong organization to pursue the process and perspective. And I would say that it's been, I would say that in order to overcome this unjustifiable crisis, we must rise above past animosities and differences and recognize the value of a unified effort to demand recognition and respect for the Serbian-American community and its mutual objectives. So I see the Political Action Committee and seeing to it that those members of Congress or those candidates are educated with respect to the concerns of the Serbian community and agreed, if you will, to provide the support necessary to overcome this dilemma.
And Dr. Mima, what say you?
There was a very important statement made. A word, it's called self-interest. We forget that. The whole point of self-interest is to align your self-interest with everybody's associated aligned self-interest. That makes action possible. And that is what it's all about. I mean, listen, I've been going back to the fundraising days of, good Lord, the 70s and Reagan, when we In fact, when Reagan first turned around the whole Slavic vote, when Vuich and the original Sava. But the key to all of this in the end is money talks. I mean, it's as simple as that. So, I mean, I come in and out of sort of the Serbian aspect because I'm often out in Africa, but the level of just this, it's not even just disrespect, it's just not being a voice of any kind in Washington on Serbian-American related issues is appalling. And it's very simple why, because the money's not behind it. So that's my position.
And that's a great segue into the second question, which is the politically successful and influential communities, including the Greek community, Korean community, Jewish community, Armenian communities, and then a lot of those communities that we have mentioned from the Balkans who are in direct opposition to the Serbian interests have been well organized and well funded. I would direct this question to Drew Hyatt, given that you are in Washington every day, you've done this in and out, you understand how this works, and you have in fact worked directly with some of these communities. What makes them so successful? And then what lacks on the Serbian side? Because as you and I have discussed many times in working together, we were sort of the only ones recently in Washington, DC, talking about the Serbian issues. Serbs, in fact, are not present. Can you tell us what makes these communities strong and present and what lacks on our side?
Yes, my experience has been that in these communities that feel they're in many times they're new American communities. They've come here, the Koreans that don't have a history like the Serbians being here since the 1850s. But they've understood that in many cases that they're a new community, that they're a minority community, and in some cases, and this is the cases of the Serbs in other communities, they've fled oppressive governments, they've fled persecution, they have fled autocratic systems where you had a vote, but the vote was meaningless because in the end it was already predetermined who was going to win. They've had limited rights. They've had no freedoms, and when they come to this country, they suddenly breathe the free air that we have here, freedoms and rights and freedoms they never enjoyed, and so they take them seriously. They don't take them for granted. And because of that, they also know that they are up in many cases against big forces, whether that's big labor, big business, other kinds of very well-heeled, very organized groups and organizations that have very sophisticated media operations, have government relations operations. They're on Capitol Hill, they're at the White House, they're in the administration, all day long talking to people, engaging. This is an interesting thing because of that, they understand that they're fighting essentially to have their voice be heard when it could be drowned out at any time by any of these other larger, more influential groups. I'll give you 3 examples of what's happened, what I've seen. In my 30 plus years of being a political strategist, working on probably more than 40 campaigns, presidential, state, local, congressional, municipal. In all that time, I handled minority and mostly ethnic outreach on political campaigns. Not once in any of those years can I ever say that I came across a group of Serbian Americans or an organization that was involved politically. In fact, this is a sad thing to say for me, but also a happy thing. The first Serbian American that I ever really met was OLGA, was Dr. Ravasi. And that at a very late age in this life. The other thing is that when I worked with the Republican National Committee, I worked directly with the Ethnic Outreach Coordinator, was a very important position. I worked with them. I came across the Greeks, I came across the Italians, the German Americans, the Koreans, some Japanese Americans, and other groups, but never did I, in my recollection, did I ever see or hear about the Serbs. And then I would also say that, and this is interesting too, having worked on Capitol Hill for 9 years, I had the privilege of working for a great member of Congress in the House who represented the south suburbs of Chicago, which has, of course, the highest concentration of Serbian Americans. I would have known if there were Serbs because of my position, if they had Serbian Americans, if they had come into the office. I would have seen any correspondence. I would have seen any email. I would have seen all of these things. And in my long stint with that member of Congress, I didn't see anything ever from Serbs, from individuals, from organizations, nothing. So my point is that at any time that the Serbian American community would choose to be a strong and forceful, or I should say a very strong and powerful economic or political force in this country, and have the kind of voice that they seem to want to have, that possibility remains open to them even today. But they have to choose that, and they have to take the steps like the other communities have, the ethnic communities and other Greek Americans and other kinds of communities have taken, to have that and to be engaged and to be taken seriously. So that's been my experience.
Excellent. And I would continue this conversation, directing this question to Congressman Poe. We have received a lot of questions about the Serbian caucus, Serbian Congressional Caucus, given that you have co-chaired that. And just looking at our screen now from Mrs. Griffin, I believe also another question. Have there been any conversations with Frank Mervan, who was just elected as a Democrat in Indiana, who has replaced Mr. Pete Wisklowski, who has expressed interest in leading the Serbian caucus? And yes, I've personally had a conversation with his office, and there's something coming up in the next couple of weeks that I cannot share just yet. But I think just in relationship to the proactive Serbian American community, while you were leading the caucus, you of course have had that personal relationship with the community. But to connect this back to what Drew was saying, have we really been present every day, 24/7 in Washington, D.C.? As Dr. Mima and Mr. Vuich know, Washington never sleeps. During your tenure, have we really been there? Have we been there enough?
Well, just to continue what Drew was saying, the answer is no. I was glad to be co-chair of the Serbian caucus. There's a lot of reasons for that, why I was, but we had numerous events, but that was just one way for Serbian voices to be heard. And generally speaking, Serbian Americans do not engage in the political process. And you can take that for whatever it's worth, but people need to be engaged in the political process. It's important to be engaged in the political process. Like David mentioned, there are those who really aren't fond of Serbs and Serbia, and they're very, very organized. One way to be organized in the political process is a political action committee. That the second word, political action committee. And supporting a political action committee, that committee then can have the voices heard that need to be heard of Serbian Americans. One other thing I'd like to mention, a PAC can do more than an individual. Under federal law, individuals are limited on how much they can contribute to an election cycle. It's about $2,700 right now per election. So that'd be the primary and the general election. Political action committees, their limitations are $5,000, so they could contribute $10,000 in a campaign. $10,000 is more money. So that is one advantage of a political action committee. But also the other things that you mentioned, Olga, is getting other folks, Serbian Americans, engaged in the political process. The caucus, we did not get a lot of support of Serbian Americans for the caucus. When we had events and invited Serbian Americans, we didn't see a lot of them. And there are a lot of Serbian Americans. So I guess my point of all of this is Serbian America needs to be engaged in the political process. That is part of being an American, is being engaged. And this committee is going to do everything it can to funnel support to people who support Serbian Americans.
And Dr. Mima, what are your thoughts on this? Because again, a lot of questions coming towards you, especially because of your work in Africa, and people that are reaching out saying you are so successful on the African continent, but exactly what you do there could be so beneficial for Serbia and for the Balkans. And you understand that Serbs, again, as all of our panelists have mentioned, are not present in Washington, D.C. How do we use Sava Pac to engage them?
Well, it's very simple. If you don't show up, you can't complain. We seem to like to complain instead of showing up
Yes.
to influence. I mean, this is over and over. Maybe I was born there, so I guess I can say it. Maybe it's inside our blood. But, complaining is not resolving and acting. You have to act if you want to have results. You complain. I mean, the reason, it's interesting. I'm sort of out of two diasporas. The Africans claim is the African diaspora, and every so often, and that's why I'm happy to come back here. My real diaspora is Serbia. But why am I effective in Africa? Because I insist I show up, and I do drive both the sort of policy side of the USG with what I do on the private side, and cobbling the capital and the money and the funding I need for whatever projects that we're doing, whether it's agri-industry, power, whatever it might be. But the common element is action. Judge Congressman Poe mentioned, that is the word. That is something that, I was 11, we moved back to Ohio, or 10. That's where I learned English, as you can tell from my accent. But the key, what I learned coming in as an immigrant at that time, is something that really is very American that I didn't have in Ethiopia, certainly as a 2-year-old back in the old Yugoslavia, do not remember. And that is that those that act, the squeaky wheel is heard. Those that don't complain, well, complain all you want. If your complaint ain't heard, you might as well complain to nobody. That's the issue. And that is the truly American way that we sometimes forget. And I really hope we can bring it out in this forum. And thank you for doing that, Olga.
Thank you. And thank you for participating in this wonderful effort that we are also proud of right now. And David, to you have spent so many decades on Capitol Hill, and also your wife has as well. You've seen some of this in action, where the Serbian opposition has raised, as you mentioned, tremendous amounts of money during the 1990s. We remember Ruder and Finn, the PR companies that were hired, in fact, on behalf of some of these communities. And in fact, they openly stated, our job was not to be moral. Our job was to create a specific type of PR for our clients. And they did that magnificently. Now, nobody is preventing the Serbian American community from defending themselves. Nobody is preventing them from participating in the political process. We have just somehow chosen not to do so. We seem to be proactive between one another. We seem to be stuck in this echo chamber where we discuss these things within our own community, but our message is not echoing outside of the community, and our voices are not being heard, especially in that political process. So David, you and Ginger have spent so many years. What has your experience been like?
Well, first of all, very quickly, and to answer a very important question here. The Serbian community has never been recognized as a threat on Capitol Hill. For obvious reasons. We've never been organized or united in perspective to pursue, if you will, offensive legislation to the Serbian community. That's our fault. There have been a number of members of Congress have gone out of their way, and which many people don't even recognize the name. People like Bill Hefner from North Carolina that I work for on a Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, very supportive. Lyle Williams from Youngstown, Ohio. Jim Saxton from New Jersey. You've never heard of those people, but those people came to our rescue because there were a handful of us that brought an issue to them, not as a united organization, but as a concerned Serb who recognized that unfortunately his community is being demonized by a larger, if you will, well-organized group that has successfully demonized and short-circuited everything we've attempted. On the other end of the spectrum, all of those who have supported us in the past and supported us on numerous occasions, to include the late Phil Crane and Ed Derwinski and those people in the past. Those people went way out of their way for us. They were always there for us, but unfortunately, and for the most part, we weren't always there for them. That's where the big gap remains. We need to make them aware that we indeed recognize the value that they value added of their support to the Serbian community, and see to it that we support them, if you will, 100% in any way, shape, or form that we can. Be it handing out pamphlets or organizing a reception or providing certain honoraria for these people. But you need to get them into your homes, you need to educate them, and you need to make them aware. I'll give you a perfect example of how we are totally oblivious to the process. We were pursuing an issue on Capitol Hill. This had to deal with the Mihailovich Monument. We obviously recognize that this issue has been battered about for years. There is more documented evidence on this issue than you can shake a stick at. So we had to overcome the fact that there are volumes of well-documented information with respect to how do we go about, if you will, recognizing Mihailovich in perspective for having recognized 500 US airmen. But that opposition was a lot more vocal than we were. But on the other hand, the only way we could overcome it on the Hill was to do what? And my wife Ginger said, you're going to be, you're not going to get a lot of support because, the opposition is well organized. Secondly, you've always had support on the Senate side. So I said, well, how do we overcome having to deal with going to a task force, a subcommittee, a committee, and the floor? And she said, a discharge petition, of which I'm sure the judge is very familiar with. But, there are those who are familiar with the process to pursue it in perspective. We attempted that, but unfortunately, there were Serbs in the community that felt they knew better than we did, and it destroyed the whole effort. So these are the types of unfortunate circumstances that we can't afford to repeat because the opposition is laughing at us. And it's time that we organize in perspective. There are organizations out there that are listening to us right now. I advise them and plead with them to unify in perspective, pursue a common objective, and that is about the Serbian community. And there's some very bright people in this group right here. And we're delighted and honored to have Congressman Poe with us, as well as Drew Hyatt and Dr. Nedelcovych, who has been a friend for over 40 years. And more importantly, with a combined effort that we have here, and as we continually spread out and interface with the existing organizations such to represent them in perspective throughout. That's the objective here.
Excellent. I'd like to move into a question that I feel it is directed towards me. I will, of course, answer it, but I also want the advisory board to explain why a PAC is formed and in which way it's going to act. And the question that I've been asked a lot is there have been some prior attempts for the Serbian Americans to organize and unify around common interests and messaging, but the community is not homogeneous. And just like much of the country, Serbs tend to be unorganized and very polarized currently. How can Sava Pac unite all Serbs when Olga was a very prominent figure in the previous election cycle? Not all Serbs were in that camp, and we don't have the same belief system in internal and also foreign politics. So the question is Sava set to act in a bipartisan manner? By Mrs. Švabić and Katarina here I have, and how is it going to act in a bipartisan manner, given the fact that Democrats are now in power? If we can start with Judge Poe on this one.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah. Yes, it is bipartisan PAC. The issue for people who want support from the PAC are people that the PAC supports, either way you want to look at it. The issue is not what party they're in. The issue is what is their philosophy about Serbian Americans and the issues we do agree on for Serbian American policy. And so that is what we look at. And we've mentioned this numerous times in our discussions, that it's bipartisan or it's really nonpartisan. The issue is not whether you're a Republican or Democrat. The issue is, what is your philosophy about Serbia and Serbian American issues? And that's what the PAC supports. Those people in both parties that have those common grounds. And really the issues for Serbian Americans is not a partisan issue. It is a Serbian American issue, and this PAC will serve the purpose of supporting candidates that support those philosophies that we all agree on.
Sure. Mr. Hyatt, would you pitch in on that one?
First of all, I think people ought to congratulate you and thank you for stepping out and showing leadership, whether it's with the Republican Party or the Democrat Party or any party, that you understand the importance of being engaged in the political process and doing what you did. So I don't see that as a negative. I see it as a positive. I think what Congressman Poe said is absolutely to the point. You know, if your leanings as a Serbian American are more toward in the Chicagoland, then chances are you're probably going to support a Democrat because there are more Democrats there. So my point is, pick a party if that's how you feel, and get engaged. And I don't see any issue here that this PAC would anyway be open to the charge of favoritism or bias toward one party or another, because what we've talked about as a board is that we're going to have a candidate questionnaire that we're going to have input from the Serbian American community about what is your vision, what are your views, what are your values. So it is a very objective yardstick, if you will, to be able to judge, to evaluate, to assess candidates where they stand on issues. If it's a Democrat who supports that, then I'm sure that we'll support the Democrat. If it's a Republican, then we'll support the Republican. But the issues do not change. The parties can change a little bit, but the issues, the priorities, the objectives of the Serbian American community are, and their interests, to go back to their interests, they are pretty much fixed. We just need to find people, and they need to help us, that they think represent their interests, their views, their values, their vision the best.
Thank you. And Dr. Mima, how do you see the bipartisan influence that you worked with for so many years?
I want to come back and use the term Congressman Poe said, nonpartisan, because you never know, we might end up with three parties. The key is nonpartisan, and I go back to that very important word learned early on, self-interest. And how do you align self-interest to make it align common interest? That's the key. And if you want to see some strange bedfellows that I've had around Africa, you wouldn't even believe it. So the key is, Where do you want it? What do you want as a result? That's the key. That's why I keep coming back to how do you take self-interest and align it with the interests that all want? And that by definition then becomes nonpartisan. So absolutely, you got to work. It's issues. Issues are not partisan. Issues are issues. That's my position.
And
if I
David,
might
how do you
interrupt.
see? Yes, please.
Just real quick, the Congressional Serbian Caucus was bipartisan. It was co-chair. It was myself, and then it was Emmanuel Cleaver from Kansas City. Well, we agreed on Serbian issues. On other issues, we may not have been on a caucus together, but on this issue, it was bipartisan, open to Republicans and Democrats that had the same philosophy about Serbia. Excuse me for interrupting.
No, not a problem. And David, please, would you continue within this framework of nonpartisan PAC that we are creating here? And again, it seems that the perception of the Serbian-American community is that it is a former Trump effort. And I will say, just because it seems that the question seems to be directed towards me, I am very proud of what the Serbian-American community has done in the previous election process, simply because it was the first time that our community was recognized as a political bloc, as an important political bloc at that level. It's never been recognized before. And I think it was an important step for us to take to engage our community, whether it was on the Democrat or the Republican side. And what I would say is that, of course, we are going to pursue this as issues strictly, and we are going to seek out those candidates who will support the issues that are of concern to the Serbian-American community, and whether they are Democrats or whether they are Republicans. If you are engaged in the political process, you very well understand how the bipartisanship here can work. But at the same time, we also have to realize that our political engagement just happened to come out of this recent campaign. And as Drew said, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think a lot of people got involved because of that. And a lot of people are now interested, especially now on both sides, Democrats and Republicans, who are reaching out to us and who are in fact looking for our support. And as Drew said, we will have a questionnaire, and there's going to be a strategy of how we identify these candidates. And on top of it, what I would say to our Serbian-American community, this is exactly where you come to be very important part of this PAC. In your community, go out and reach out to candidates, reach out to your elected representatives. Have you taken a group of your fellow Serbs ever to go and meet your elected representative? Do you know whose congressional district you live in? Have you talked to them about Serbian-American issues? Have you talked to them about what are the concerns of the wider community? These are all the steps that you can proactively take to identify those candidates or to identify those elected officials who we can as a community work with. So David, please, if you can expand on this a little bit.
I think it remains incumbent upon us also to recognize the importance of well-established agenda. That agenda needs be such that includes specific issues and concerns of the Serbian community, not only in the diaspora, but also those concerns that our relatives and friends in the homeland are unfortunately confronted with, whereby legislation may have a positive or negative impact. So therefore, it becomes an incumbent upon us as we look at various candidates at the, in this case, at the federal level, the House or the Senate or some state levels, introduce them not only to the Serbian community, especially for those states that are do not have a large Serbian constituency, but at least make them aware and educate them with respect to the concerns of the Serbian community, both on both sides of the aisle, the Republican as well as the Senate, Republican as well as the Democrat side of the aisle. So they all can hopefully commiserate and recognize the value of supporting issues of concerns. So I think it becomes very important that we educate these people in perspective and make them aware that we've been here for quite a few years. We've contributed a great deal to the general welfare of what this country represents. We have a fellow by the name of Poping who organized a group called NCACA, which is today called NASA. He was the actual chairman of the original NASA and the space programs. Not very many people know about that. And right now I'm attempting to pursue seeing Poping recognized in this next moon launch. But anyhow, these are the types of things that we need to at least convey to members, to staff, to whatever have you. During the campaigns, for example, you need to get the congressman and his staff aside and said, are you familiar with these issues? If not, these are the areas on which we're concerned, and we'd appreciate your support, those types of things. But both sides of the aisle are very important. We cannot be a partisan organization. And that would destroy our objectives.
And then the follow-up question to that was, is the advisory board looking to expand its ranks and have maybe a Democrat on our advisory board? So absolutely, we are actually working with few people. And if any of our honorable panelists would give any ideas, can we reach out to not just Democrats? I believe, as we said, this is a very important bipartisan or nonpartisan issue. So yes, we welcome Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, and the rest. So one other question that seems to be sort of tilting towards lobbying, which we need to separate the two. PAC is not a lobbyist organization, but the question was that, and especially for former Congressman Poe, that during the past 30 years, there has been a disproportionate amount of US taxpayers funded assistance that has been allocated to the Serbian population in the former Yugoslavia. But in the past, US aid has been conditioned to Serbia's cooperation with the Hague War Crimes Tribunal and Kosovo's Serb participation in Kosovo's newly formed democratic institutions. What is the best way to have current and future congressmen and senators re-examine the most efficient allocation of US taxpayer resources? And somebody brought up the fact that APAC is a very successful organization in having a lot of US aid sent, for example, to Israel. Serbia doesn't seem to be at that level, of course, of receiving specific US aid, and it has been conditioned upon specific things. Now, can a PAC be useful to engage this type of a conversation?
Well, it can be, but there are specific federal laws that separate a political action committee from a lobbyist. Lobbyists have to register, and they're under different rules. They cannot do the same. Political action committee, as I said, as we've said, supports financially candidates and obtains funds from across the country, and that money then is used to support candidates. A lobbyist is a completely different animal, and it's regulated differently, and neither the twain shall meet. So it's important that we understand that. I think APAC, though, is not a political action committee. Drew, is that correct?
Yes, sir. That's my understanding.
They are a 501c4 registered, which is something we are discussing.
They're a lobbying organization.
Yeah. They just use the name APAC, but they are not a political action committee. They are a lobbyist.
Sure.
So big difference between the two.
Absolutely. Also a question that we had a conversation about, and again, specifically PAC is conditioned by federal election law. And the questions keep coming in terms of, can Republic of Serbia and Republic of Srpska help Sava? Because ultimately what we do will be in their interest. And I think this needs to be stressed very strongly, that this, the two cannot have any kind of communication. And I would ask Mr. Drew Hyatt to expand on this because it is a very important legal aspect.
Yes, what Congressman Poe says is absolutely correct. The mission of Sava is to provide financial support to candidates for office, for federal office. That would be the President and Vice President of the United States, and then the members of Congress. It has no role and should have no role and would be prohibited from having a role in any direct lobbying activities. Lobbying being defined as those activities which are with the intent to change existing policy, change existing law, or create new law or to create new policy, just very briefly. So like as the Congressman said, those things are prohibited from what we're doing. Now, I would say, to go back and just make one other point, we can, for example, say in our questionnaire, this is an issue that we believe is important to the Serbian-American community that has to do with this or this. And so there we can express a view, and candidates can either accept that view, agree with it, and represent that. And that way we can have influence. There can be no direct or indirect influence, including money, the different money, lobbying, anything whatsoever that would influence the Sava Pac from any government, from any organization that's affiliated with the government. And we must maintain that bright line distinction and fence line, if you will, boundary between the two. That's the principle of non-interference in U.S. and or American political system. We've had a whole slew of charges about Russians and Chinese and all that. So that's been done indirectly, but we cannot have received money from any foreign government to help us in any way, or any in-kind contribution lists, for example, lists or other things like that.
Sure, and I would address this question to David and Dr. Mima, especially coming from the Serbian background. We still don't have precise numbers of how many Serbian Americans, in fact, live in the United States. We are hoping for some positive census figures, and Drew and I discussed this right before we got on the call, understanding where Serbs live, how many Serbs are in the United States, and how we use those numbers as our strength. And a question from Mr. Goran Belnogic was, what is Sava's strategy to reach out to all the Serbs across the board, and what kind of messaging are we going to send other than fundraising? So David, maybe if you can start off with that.
The latest census, I'm not sure has been released as yet.
Not yet, yes.
I would think that there's been a movement within the Serbian community. A few individuals found it necessary to at least remind Serbs when the census questionnaire is received that they identify themselves as Serbs. In the past, that really hasn't happened, because you have Serbs that are either married to an Englishman or whatever have you. Then you have Serbs that have changed their names. So all of which hasn't been taken in consideration. But the fact remains is we've always talked about in the past the fact that there are approximately 1.2 million Serbs or more in this country. I think the fact remains is whatever it takes to at least convey to the greater percentage of our constituency or our population here in the United States would be anything from an email or to a snail mail or to the types of things that we're currently engaged in here, to at least make them aware of the importance of who we are. because there is also an identity crisis here, of which we have yet to at least introduce the American community of who the Serbs are and what they've contributed to this country. As I mentioned Putin earlier, there's Tesla, there's the people that put men on the moon, all those types of things. We're sort of sitting in the back, patting each other on the back, but very few people know who we are. And that's our fault. Again, we have an identity crisis. So I think there is a number of areas that we need to address with respect to our population as a whole. What have we really contributed to this country? What can we be proud of? The 10 or so Congressional Medal of Honors that have been awarded to our members of the military, to include members of Congress, to include the scientists and engineers. We need to show that pride within our community that will bring us closer rather than further apart. We need to find out within our community, how do we go about unifying and showing pride in our community? As I mentioned, the other factor of how we go about fundraising for the types of objectives that we're discussing here, we need to seriously consider such an event, especially here in Washington, that represents an American Serbian Achievement Award banquet, something along those lines, but recognize not only those who are currently contributing, but those who have contributed in the past. So everybody knows who we are. That's the problem we're dealing with also. It's an identity problem.
So Dr. Mima, how do you feel about our identity crisis that's been going on, it seems, for quite some time?
Well, it's natural. I mean, look at just the different ways that we've come around here. I mean, David, born here, and I remember my father saying by his accent, he could tell, even though he was born here, what part of the country his parents come from. Me that came at 10, through to the ones that are arriving now. If you look at the last, 10 years, a big, large influx of people that are escaping out of, the confusion that we had in back home, and that home back in Serbia. So the key is, how do you really capture all those? We all have totally different backgrounds. You really have to get down to finding those common themes, common interests, again, the aligned interests, and start driving that through. And that action, that in itself, will then attract people in. I've got to say, even myself get thoroughly confused when we start getting over the differences of various patriarchs and religions and God knows what. And I say that, and it's probably even more the case with the new arrivals. So let's find the common elements, highlight them, drive them, get it out, and then success breeds success. You start building that, they'll get attention, then everybody likes to join the band, but you got to get the bandwagon started. That's the key. So I think that's really what we got to get to. And that's why, again, nonpartisan, forget it. What are the common issues, common interests? And don't forget the David, the Mima, and the most recent Nebojša that's arrived are totally different backgrounds, but they do have common interests.
Yes, and that is what the PAC actually wants to build upon. What is the smallest common denominator for most of us to come around? And just having had this conversation about the census figures and the numbers, Drew, could you expand on the strength in numbers and then the strength as a political bloc of Serbs who are politically awake, let's say, and who can actually make that impact?
Well, let me just go back to one thing. I think there's still some clarification that's needed between regarding a PAC and policy, influencing policy or formulating policy. The PAC is not, it does not engage in lobbying or in any way trying to affect changes in policy or law or regulation in any way. It cannot do that. Given its charter from the Federal Election Commission, it is prohibited from engaging in those activities. That does not mean that in the candidate questionnaire that an issue can be highlighted about, for example, a potential undercount of Serbian Americans in the United States, and would you support such a policy, or would you support reaching out to or a change in law or whatever to ensure that all Serbian Americans are counted in the United States? So that's how we can engage only through that means. Now, my experience in running, I don't know, working on I don't know how many campaigns at all levels, I would say this: the Serbian American community, whether it's 1.2 million or it's 100,000, it doesn't really matter. It'd be nice to have the 1.2 million, obviously, but if only to the degree are they politically relevant if they're politically engaged. To David's point, to Congressman Poe's point, to Dr. Mima's point, it doesn't really make any difference if you're not engaged, because our system has been set up by our founders from the beginning to not be a passive system, but to be a participatory system. And you have to do the work in order to be able to protect those freedoms and to exercise those rights. And if you're not willing to do that, to go back to Dr. Mima's point, then you really don't have a right to complain about it. Let's just be honest about that, right? We can't complain if we don't suit up for the game and play the game. We can't really complain about what the score is in the end. So my point is that in congressional districts, I've worked for senators, I've worked for House members, I've worked worked for a governor. You would be surprised what would happen if you got 4 or 5 letters from Serbian Americans in a congressional district. That would be enough to get that member's attention and be able to think about, these people I need to pay attention because behind them are families and friends and all kinds of other voters. So what we need to do is we need to, again, have people support the PAC financially, and then they need to get engaged at the local level as they should, getting out the vote, having coffees, meeting the member, passing out literature, knocking on doors, talking to their friends, sending email, all these other activities they're supportive. My point is this: if you're not going to take these rights seriously, there would be a hue and cry in this country if someone said, the government said, you know, if you don't vote in elections, we're not going to give you that right anymore. You lose that right. If you think that there are about 1.2 million Serbs in this country, that means in almost 8 different states that those voters would be disenfranchised in 8 states, 8 major states. And in cities of 1.2 million and below, let's cut off maybe about 100,000, there were about probably 300 cities in this country of size where Serbians would just be denied the vote. But if we try to take that, if someone tried to take that vote away today and those rights away today, people would say, oh my goodness, that's unfair. But isn't it the same thing when you do not exercise those rights and you don't participate to the fullest level that you're allowed by law? It's just not enough today to be passive and vote and think you've done your duty. There's so much money, there's so much activity, there's so much engagement in the political process today because the stakes, the outcomes in policy make differences for people. And if we're not going to, and I say this not as a Serbian American, if we're not going to participate in the process, then we are surrendering our rights and our right to influence policies that we may have to live with, but are vehemently opposed to. And that's what's happening, what David's talked about, the opposition, what they have been very effective at. They have been very, very effective at that. So
sure.
Go ahead.
Yes, go ahead, please.
No, go ahead. That was
Judge Paul, and this is just an observation from Mike. He says the Serbs are very good in individual endeavors and achievements, but are not very persistent in monolith group projects. Other than team sports, of course, we have been very, very successful in those. But from Mr. Stevanovic, what accounts for the better motivation of these other ethnic groups, such as Greeks and Armenians? What are these other ethnic communities doing successfully that the Serbian community is not doing? And I think I want to tag a little bit of that to 1990s and to systematic brainwashing and demonization and a certain type of apathy that has developed through the Serbian community because they've been so beaten down. It seems that at this point, they don't trust the politicians here. They don't trust the politicians back in Serbia. They're existing in this vacuum. How would you advise the Serbian-American community to sort of snap out of this apathetic presence?
Get in the game.
Exactly.
Drew said it best. Serbian Americans, and we've talked about this, Serbs are a lot like Texans. And I say this affectionately, hard-headed and independent, and vocal on, has an opinion. Serbs have an opinion on everything, but that opinion has got to be shared and move, and you have to move forward. And the only way you do that, you get in the political game. We call that politics. And you have an action committee that is engaged in the game and has to support the candidates that have like-minded concepts. But get in the game, be action, move together, join on the things that we can agree on, and in a way, kind of be incensed at the fact that people are always beating down on the Serbs, and rather just say they're beating down on us, get in the game. And that's what this political action committee is, to elect people who have those common ideals about Serbian Americans and moving forward in the game.
And that's a brilliant segue into what I hear often. Politics is a contact sport. And given that we're so good at these team sports, you would think that we are good at attacking these issues head on. But question now, and I would say this would be our final question, unless our panelists want to share anything at the end. But we had this discussion last week when we got together as a board together. Mr. Alex Macheski is asking, have we identified so far any candidates that are aligned with the interests of the Serbian people? When we did exchange a little bit about some of our experiences with the candidates, few of them are reaching out to us on their own. And as many of you would note, every week in our newsletter, we do send out an interview if we've conducted an interview with the candidate that has reached out. And the reason why we put those interviews out is because we want our community to actually get to know these candidates. We're calling this series Meet the Candidates, but at this point, we have not endorsed anybody. We are just letting the candidates speak to you. There are several of them who have expressed their desire to get to know the Serbian community. So if any of our panelists could answer that, Congressman Poe, we discussed a candidate out of Illinois, Karolina Lauf. We also discussed several other people who are Serbian Americans, in fact. So I would like all of the panelists to pitch in and tell us a little bit more of their vision, who we endorse, how we endorse, and what that process is going to look like. Judge Poe, we can start with you.
I envision that we will, as mentioned by Drew, that we will have a questionnaire, and people who are interested in getting endorsement and money from the PAC must first fill out the questionnaire. And then the committee evaluates it and decides whether or not to support that candidate, regardless of party, and make that decision. And so that's the way I envision it to be. And I do want to say again, this PAC is not a lobby. It is a political action committee to support candidates financially.
David, maybe talk to us about candidates that you have mentioned on Monday that we could potentially look into.
Yeah, I was talking about Brnovich in Arizona and Parnell in the Pittsburgh area are two. And there are a number of others, but the fact remains is, as we discussed here this afternoon, it remains important for all of us to recognize an education process here. Even though these candidates may not represent a large Serbian constituency. Who knows once they are elected, and as to whether or not they're going to be assigned to the Foreign Relations Committee that's going to have a result or have an answer or a voice in issues concerning Serbia or the Serbian community. So I think education is a very important factor, and at least bringing them up to snuff. They, again, understand we have an awful lot of homework to do, because the opposition has been very successful in demonizing us. We unfortunately have been bombed to smithereens, and our people have suffered the consequences. Very few of these people in the United States are aware of the fact that one of the largest US military facilities in Europe is in Kosovo. How many people know about? Not a lot. But the fact remains is we need to educate those candidates, and we need to remind those who have been elected of the importance of who we are, not only as constituents, but recognize the importance of the value of who we are as American citizens. Last but not least, and you made mention of it earlier, specifically in the sports jargon, of which I'll allow for my bit of humor. I usually compare the Serbs to an American football team. The difference is that the Serbs have 11 quarterbacks.
Dr. Mima, what say you on our candidate election?
You know, I'm probably the weakest in terms of identifying specific people. I'm overseas, although not this past year, but usually overseas more than in the US. But I think the suggestion, obviously, with the questionnaire, you know, the key is getting out there and finding out who has those common interests with us. As to how you get away from 11 quarterbacks, David. You know how? Only when a coach finally shows up and says, you know what, you 11 quarterbacks just lost the game. Here's a team here, there's one quarterback. Want to try a different way? Want to play to win? That coach and that PAC will be successful.
Yeah.
That'd be my ending word on it.
I think one thing that we're all familiar with, those of us who have worked the process here, during a campaign activity, there's an awful lot of receptions, coffees, teas, rallies, whatever the case may be. It would certainly, again, behoove the Serbian community to play an active role in all of these, not only an active role of those that have been organized, but organize several on behalf of a specific member. That way you're organizing, say, a fundraiser for him, or a tea, or a dinner, or a reception, whatever the case may be. That gets you an awful lot of exposure. The Serbian community is now supporting Congressman Ted Poe for president. And then we got the place jam-packed with people. But
Yes.
the Serbian
I'll contribute
community
to that.
is doing that.
I'll sign up. And that is actually that important part where, again, as I mentioned earlier, this is where the Serbian community gets proactively engaged. Please help us identify the candidates that are running in your area. We will have a questionnaire prepared, and we cannot be all things to all people, of course, but at the same time, we can work towards that smallest common denominator where we will send a questionnaire to the candidates that you identify in your own community, that you have met with, that you have gone to tea or lunch or a fundraiser to, and told us, this is the candidate that I met. They're interested in getting to know the Serbian community. Please send a questionnaire. So this is where we need you to be that proactive force on the ground, because during the previous campaign, that is exactly what we did. We formed teams in each state, and those state teams went out to campaign. And as they campaigned, they actually ended up meeting other candidates, other people who are interested in running for political office. This is exactly where the Serbian-American community will play a proactive role. Be a point of contact in your own state. take a group of your Serbian American friends and go meet these candidates and talk to them about these issues. And I think that is how we can work together and how we can engage everybody. And as we are closing our session today, I would like each one of our panelists to send their specific message to the Serbian American community. And again, let's start with our president of the board. David, what have you to tell to the Serbian Americans?
The fact remains, as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of Serbian organizations out there that have made numerous attempts to pursue the political process. Unfortunately, that hasn't worked out as well to represent all of our issues in perspective. We have found ourselves caught by surprise on numerous occasions, frantically seeking qualified professional support within our community to come to our rescue. We don't know who to call. If we had embedded in the House or the Senate or some other government agency who at least we can call upon to assist us in pursuing certain issues and concerns that Serb have, we don't have that. Secondly, we remain at a loss to provide an immediate response to these unfortunate issues and concerns that require a unified organization of professionals representing the American Serbian community. And that's why I'm reaching out and pleading to all of the American Serbian organizations throughout the United States to recognize the value of what the Political Action Committee represents and at least respond positively and send us your recommendations, send us how you see this moving forward and how you would like to play an active role.
Judge Poe, closing remarks.
Well, it's all been said, but not everybody said it. So I will conclude with an amen to much of what has been said. The Political Action Committee is going to be a action-based to support people of either party or nonpartisan, who uphold Serbian ideals and want the Serbian American people to have a voice. And it will take money to do that. And so that's what this Political Action Committee is. Raise money, support those candidates who have those concepts that most of us share regarding Serbia and Serbian American people.
Dr. Mima.
I come back to my favorite word. Identify your self-interest, find out how to align them with others that have this common interest. Use a very important word, Olga, that common lowest denominator. What is it that actually everybody can agree on? And then that issue becomes what we can then put forward through the PAC. And I would add one more thing. The PAC is not only going to be supporting those that agree with our issues, but also hurting those that don't, hurting in the sense of finding proper opposition to those that do not agree. There's both sides of the game. So you want to have contact sport? There's a proper contact sport right there for you. So
excellent point. And Drew?
I would say this, I like group or lists. So I would say 3 C's. First of all, conviction. Believe that as Serbian Americans, that your voice matters and that it's important and that it needs to be heard. Because when you do that, then we get better policies, we get better elected officials, we get better representation, and you need to be involved. Also believe and know that if you chose today to be one of the most powerful forces and voices in American politics, that can happen today through action. Second of all, a commitment to action. What does that mean? It means not just showing up on election day and voting, which is very important. It's the most important thing, but all the other activities that lead up to that are equally important, beginning with supporting the Sava Pac, giving $5, $10, give it consistently if you can. Meet with your candidates, find candidates, meet with your members of Congress, talk to them about issues that are important. You invite them to your home, invite them to your communities, hold coffees for them, knock on doors for them, pass out literature, do everything you can to become important to them and to their reelection or to their election. And the last thing is consistency. This is not one and done. We don't give $10 or pass out one piece of literature or talk to one friend. We have to have consistent action over time. And the cumulative effect of that will help us put our candidates in Congress and in the White House. And that's what we need to do.
Excellent, and thank you very much. I'd like to go back to this final closing comment from, again, Mike, who says 11 quarterbacks. It's because Serbs expect the referee to be against them. So that is the type of mentality that we have had. And it is ultimately true, but that is the fact, and an unfortunate fact, of 30 years lack of activity on our part. So now all of the opposition that has had that activity, they're ahead of the game. So we have a lot of catching up to do, but that doesn't mean that we are incapable of catching up. And as Dr. Mima said, it works both ways. We are going to oppose that, and we are also going to push towards the issues that are of concern to our community. So again, thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to everybody who participated, who sent us wonderful questions. Please keep the questions coming. If we did not address a question today, we will certainly do so in the future. There are a few other questions that we have received, but again, they are more focused towards lobbying. So maybe we can, in fact, work as a board to answer those internally. Again, David, thank you for all of your work. Dr. Mima, thank you for being a part of this great effort. Judge Poe, as always, thank you for everything you have done for the Serbian-American community and just being a part of this. You continue to work very hard for us. And Drew, as a friend and as somebody who has helped me push for Serbian issues in Washington, D.C., thank you for helping us, and thank you for joining this wonderful panel.
Thank you.
Keep it coming, keep the questions coming, and we have a lot of work ahead of us. Thank you to all of those who have expressed interest in supporting this PAC and who have already sent some contributions. My name is Dr. Olga Ravasi, and again, Serbian-American Voters Alliance in partnership with Serbian Radio Chicago. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.